You hear me? All right, good. Good. Well, it's great to be back with everybody today. Last week, I hope I didn't confuse you too much. I tried to provide us with an overview of liminality, this time of betwixt and between that we're all so familiar with right now, where we cross over a threshold, go from what has been familiar routines, familiar places, cross over the threshold and enter into new space that's a little bit unknown and a bit uncomfortable, and we're not sure of exactly where we are or where we're going, what's next. And that's what we call liminal space, a place of not knowing, a place of uncertainty.
Right.
And we talked some about our feelings about that, what reactions we have in liminal space. We talked about some of the dangers of liminal space, the tendency toward authoritarian, totalitarian figures and governments, the tendency toward fundamentalist religion, where the answers are easy and simple, and there's no nuance and no grappling with paradox. But it's also a time when some of our old certainties begin to give way and we're able to think in a new way. It is the place where real transformation can take place. But I talked a good bit about the fact that it's an important time that we learn to listen more deeply, quietly, listen for God's still small voice in our lives. And then I ended last week with a very hurried overview of the New and Old Testaments and arguing there that I'm beginning to see virtually the entire Bible as being a narrative, a collection of stories about people who are in liminal space and time. There's a, how do we put it? There's a not yetness about the lives of the people in the Bible's biblical story. They are still on the way. They're still growing in their relationship with God and others and self. What I'm doing here is I'm pushing against the notion that the Bible is primarily a book about doctrine, a book of fixed principles, a book that is intended to provide tight certainty for those at least who get it right and those who hold the right doctrine. But to me, that is not where people in liminal space and time land. There's a reason that the early Christians were called the people of the way, because indeed they were still on the way, following their risen Lord, following the urgings of the Holy Spirit, continuing on their journey on the way, still growing toward that wholeness of restoration in the image of God. We often call that growing into our true selves. But there are people that are not yet. And when we move the focus away from certainty and absolute clarity to who's gotten it right and who's gotten it wrong and who gets in and who's barred from the kingdom, because all of that puts the focus on me. It's all about what happens to me. I get saved. I'm a part of the elect. You might even call it a very selfish view of spirituality. Notice today, though, the focus in Psalm 77 that I want us to look at in a little more detail today. Because having certainty of doctrine, knowing better than others do, being rigid about that certainty, we really reject this idea of liminality in space and time, and we place ourselves right up there on the throne. The I becomes the center of things, the throne. Liminality, though, forces us off the throne. forces the I, the me, off the throne, back into the journey towards wholeness. You might recall that Jesus warned about this in his conversation with Peter at Caesarea Philippi. Peter wanted clarity. He wanted a resolution of the not knowing that went with the journey of discipleship. But instead, Jesus offered him only a cross, not the clarity and certainty that Peter had wanted. Instead, Jesus offered him the liminality of the journey to the cross, which involves not knowing everything, the not yetness of the road to discipleship. Jesus said to Peter, and these are words that are both puzzling but profound, anyone who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life, that is, grasps onto and holds tightly to his life, will lose it. And whoever loses his life will find it. Now, I find that hard to explain. It's hard to take it in. In fact, we have to, I think, live into its truth. Peter himself didn't understand it. And we struggle as well to understand it. It's paradoxical. I would suggest it's even mysterious. And I think there are grave dangers in abandoning paradox and mystery and liminality for overly simplistic, clear, certain, rigidly dogmatic doctrinal answers. But as we ponder what Jesus has said, and I do believe that it is painted with colors of liminality and mystery, I see connections to the dynamics and lessons of Psalm 77. And I want us to turn to that. If you've got your Bibles, I'm going to be using the New Revised Standard Version, but there are lots of other versions that are fine. I read a book by Walter Brueggemann, who was a professor of theology at Columbia Seminary. He lives in Atlanta, and he wrote this book called Virus as a Summons to Faith, Biblical Reflections in a Time of Loss, Grief, and Anxiety. And it's typical Walter Brueggemann, hard to understand. He talks deep. He goes deep into these Hebrew texts, and he appreciates the profound insights, but it takes some struggle. You have to hang with him in order to fully get what he's talking about. But I want us to do that with Psalm 77 today. I want us to look at it in some depth, and it's a psalm of lament. That is a song of complaining about the way that things are, but it's also a psalm of liminality. Note one thing about the psalm, the way that the first of it, the psalmist is completely preoccupied with the self, with the I, with the me. And that will shift later in the psalm, and we'll talk about that. Let me read it to you. Notice the language. I cry aloud to God, that he may hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God and I moan. I meditate and my soul faints. Are you getting the focus of the psalmist? You keep my eyelids from closing. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old and remember the years of long ago. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. You can just hear the preoccupation with self-centeredness, worried about himself alone. So watch the way in which this perspective will finally begin to change, and we'll talk some about where it begins to change. What comes next in verses 7 through 9, though, are a series of rhetorical questions, but the focus is still on the I, on the me. The psalmist does not yield this agenda of self. But the psalmist does begin to do something very, very important in the spiritual life, and that is the psalmist begins to ask urgent faith questions. But all of them are still emerging out of that self-concern. And pay attention to these questions, because these questions go to the very heart of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith. They go to the very heart of what we can depend upon in terms of the nature and character of God, which in the end is all we have. Notice the language: will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love ceased forever? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Now, right there, the psalmist has called into question everything that the Jewish people and Christians hold most dearly about the nature of God. Has his steadfast love ceased forever? Hesed, the steadfast love of God. One of the questions I love to tease people with and disciple is, where do you find the most concentrated focus on love in the entire scripture? And of course, everybody goes right to the New Testament, Jesus talking about love all the time. And I said, well, go to a concordance and look up the word love. And where is it predominant and where is it less mentioned? And people are shocked to find that it's mentioned a lot more. I mean, pages and pages of mention of love, the steadfast love of God in the Old Testament, but a lot rarer in the New Testament. It's based on the Jewish understanding of the steadfast love of God, which was right at the central part of their journey with God. And the psalmist lament, is it gone? Is it gone forever? Has the steadfast love of God vanished? And that's a faith question, because we often encounter that in our own journeys. We ask that same question. But the second thing, the psalmist asks, are God's promises at an end? And you'll remember the biblical story from the beginning of from Genesis around chapter 11. We begin to hear about the promises of God, the promises to Abraham, the promises to his descendants, the great promises that God made to his people. And one of the themes of the entire Bible is just that, the promises that God has made. We have a great hymn that we used to sing in the church. We may still do occasionally, but it's rare. Standing on the promises. You may know that. We still think about those promises. And the psalmist asked the question, are those promises that God has made to Moses and to us and to Abraham, are those promises gone forever? And then finally, what may be the ultimate insult to God, has God forgotten to be gracious? You'll recall that Paul, in encountering God, came down to the bottom line. God said, I can't tell you a great deal about this pain, but I can tell you this, and you can put this in the bank, and you can count on this and this alone. My grace is sufficient. But what the psalmist is saying now is that true? He's alleging to God, accusing God, and saying, your grace is empty, God. God, you've forgotten me. You've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten what you have promised. Deep, deep faith questions. But in verse 10, all of a sudden we get to something that is hard to understand. The psalmist says, and I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. What does that mean? It's clear, this as much is clear, that we're at a critical turn. obviously there is a deep grief in the psalmist's heart, a trouble or a grief. And then we begin to understand what the psalmist is talking about, that the fear is that God has changed, that what the psalmist could count on about God, steadfast love and promises and forgiveness and and grace, that all of that's gone, that God has abandoned that character, and that is no more. It's a disturbing time. But the question is that a question of faith, or is that a question of abandoning faith? Is it an opening for the development of a new and deeper faith, a faith that is not based on one's own needs, but based on a deeper understanding of God, perhaps a God who is also holy, a God who is also mysterious, a God who is awesome. Now, this verse right here gives translators a tough time. I love the Message translation of this, which is often a creative interpretation. Peterson writes this translation: "Just my luck," I said. "The high God has gone out of business just the moment I need him." I love that translation by Eugene Peterson, or this translation from the Renew. "I remember how he has responded to my prayers in the past, but I get nothing from him now. Nothing save the echoes of my agonies screamed into the empty heavens." Or this from the New English Bible: "Has his right hand," I said, "lost its grip? Does it hang powerless, the arm of the Most High?" Now, all those, I think, are good translations that begin to get to the depths of the psalmist's agony in pleading this lament. One translation I don't recommend, many people use the NIV, and I think it reduces the tension. I think it tries too quickly to resolve the tension and get on to the good news. The NIV reads, "Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years of the right hand of the Most High." You see, that just resolves the tension and gets you right into the resolution of the tension. What I think verse 10 does, though, it invites us to sit for a while, to listen in silence for a while. It begins a time for the psalmist of waiting, of resisting, of dying. We sometimes call this a time of impasse, where we simply don't know where to go, a time of deep and profound liminality, where we don't know the answer. It is also called in the mystical tradition the dark night of the soul. And I suggest to us today that perhaps our meditation needs to stop here for a while. It needs to linger here for a moment, for maybe days, for maybe longer. Now, I'm not going to take days. We'll only linger for a moment. But I hope you do get the sense that something is happening right now that's very important. And we need to give it time to stew in our hearts. We need to give it time to blossom forth in our hearts before we get too easily to the answers. The psalmist is beginning to see another way of looking at God. Isaiah talks about this way. Isaiah says, "Thus saith the Lord, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways." Maybe the ways we try to use God, maybe the ways we try to pigeonhole God into our categories is simply not sufficient to the actual character of God. The Holy One of Israel is not confined to our narrow categories, our narrow ways of looking at things. And so perhaps we need to linger a bit longer and go a little bit deeper. perhaps we've come to a time of impasse, as we do in our lives so frequently, of deep liminality and need to listen better. And what the psalmist does, I think, is the psalmist holds that liminality, that doubt, that not knowing in his heart. He holds the pain, if you will. He holds the pain of not knowing and lets it sit there for a while. He is practicing what most of us dread. I dread. And that's a time of holy waiting. There's a great meditation by Richard Rohr where he connects this up to the waiting of Jesus and the waiting of Mary at the cross. He says we shouldn't try to get rid of our pain, the impasse that is before us, before we learn what it has to teach us. He writes, if we can hold our pain and continue to trust in God in that pain, we will finally find ourselves in a special place where God speaks a new word to us. And he believes that that's what Jesus was doing on the cross. He was holding that pain, not shouting insults to others, not proposing a grand plan, but he was holding the pain of the world, taking it into himself. Rohr says that's how he saves us, through holding the pain of the world for us. Mary, sitting at the foot of the cross, does the same thing. She holds that pain for us. And that's one of the core mysteries of faith. And it leads to an understanding of, an appropriation of the mystery and the wonder of resurrection. I hope you this week will spend a little time holding that as well, holding it in your hearts and learning what it has to teach you. The psalmist finally, though, begins to get to a place where he's able to understand a bit about the hiddenness of God. The hiddenness of God. And often people are shipwrecked in their faith because they don't appreciate the hiddenness, the mystery of God. They do not understand that God's providential ways in the world are not always done by our standards, on our timing, in our way. And our faith becomes shipwrecked because we know only that and not the mystery of God's ways. But here I think the psalmist is beginning to understand some of that in this moment of impasse. And I want us to go just for a few moments I want to show you my notes. This is what my notes look like. They're all over the place. They reflect the confusion of this moment of impasse. But the psalmist holds this not knowing. And in doing so, his focus begins to shift some, away from the preoccupation with I and me, my understanding, my needs, my standards, my ways. They begin to fade away. And the language, the new orientation begins to slightly shift and then dramatically shift in a very different direction, from my way to God's way, an awareness of the depths of God's real character and God's ways. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on your work and muse on your mighty deeds. The psalmist is beginning to shift. And that's not an easy shift to make, because we have to give up that deep reliance upon my needs, my perspective, my way. And the psalmist is beginning to shift that and hear God's promises, the history of God with his people in a new and different way. Notice two things about what happens next. In verse 13, your way, O God, is holy. And then at the end of 19, yet your footprints were unseen. In between those two realities, the psalmist will begin to see God's history with him and with God's people in a new way. God's way is holy, but God's way is often hidden from us in the otherness and mystery of God. God's way is not always clearly visible in human history or in world history. Back to Isaiah again. 55, 8 through 9. Oh, we need to read Isaiah. We need to understand the fifth gospel if we are to understand Jesus and his promises. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, saith God, nor are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your thoughts, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Paul picks up that same thought, for God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. Even Paul says we need to look at the mystery of God's presence on the cross if we are to understand God's presence in the world. But now the psalmist sees all of this in a brand new way. And he recites some of those ways in verses 13 through 19. He's really retelling the Exodus story. If you ever want to know what the Exodus story means, don't listen to us white preachers read that story. Go to a black church. And I tell you, when they start telling the Exodus story, it's not a story about the long ago. It's their story. It's a story that's personal. It's a story that's powerful. You'll hear the audience come alive and the amens will begin and the preach it brother will begin, and you will hear people beginning to involve themselves deeply in the retelling of this story. I know we got a long way to go in 2-3 minutes, but I want to tell you about a story about some things that happened at Coming First United Methodist Church. When I first got there, when MLK Day came around, I said, we're going to, each MLK Day, we're going to devote it to the story of civil rights in our part of the world. And each year I would preach a sermon. A couple of years I preached on my good friend Rosa Parks. On another year I preached about Emmett Till. Another year I preached on the young ladies in Birmingham were killed. Year after year I preached about our need to understand that story. But as a part of that worship service, every year we were blessed to have Clark Atlanta's choir come and sing for us. It became one of the most popular Sundays there at approaching Easter Sunday and Christmas Sunday in terms of popularity. But one thing I noticed about that choir, when they sang about the Exodus story, they came alive. And every year we would sing another song. It's in our hymn book. Every voice sing. When a white congregation sings it, they sing it like all the rest of the hymns, you know, kind of, yeah, yeah. When they sang it, though, they didn't need their books. They knew it by heart, and they knew it deep in their hearts. It was amazing. It was spellbinding to hear Clark Atlanta sing "Lift Every Voice and Sing," written by James Weldon Johnson. It's the hymn of the civil rights movement. He was the founder of the NAACP and wrote many great poems and songs. But when they sang those words of lifting every voice and sing, let the harmonies of liberty ring, sing a song full of the dark past has taught us. They knew about that dark past. Stony the road we have trod, treading the path through the blood of the slaughters. They know that history. They know it. It's alive to them. And when they sing this song, they sing this song of hope. And with an understanding that God's ways are so often mysterious that we don't always understand those ways. Well, I got a lot more to say. I've got about, I have quotes from Richard Rohr. I do want to get to one more thing very briefly. Our stories are important, the stories that we tell. But sometimes we have to go back in and rework our stories because we get it wrong the first time. We are wounded, and we have to understand new possibilities in our stories. So storytelling becomes very important, and retelling our stories. Um, if you want to know more about this, go to Nicole Connor's blog site, where she talks about her escape from fundamentalist religion, the certainty. She said she had become addicted to certainty, her time in liminal space, and then her escape from that. And it's a monumental book that monumental writings that she does that I highly recommend, where she jumped from the certainty that she had been addicted to and was released into liminality, into a new time. And now she does what is called narrative therapy, where she helps damaged people, wounded people, look back over their life story and see if there are other meanings that they could attribute to their life story, new meanings that they could live into, new values that are old, but values that they could see in a new way, and help in their healing process toward wholeness. I recommend her blog site, recommend her writings, because she is leading a new movement called narrative therapy. And I think it is a very powerful thing where people are learning to retell their stories in a brand new way. Do we stop at 11 or 12?
You stop when you're done.
We stop at 11. Okay. But I commend her. You can find her blog, Nicole Connor blog. It's called Mugwump, and she's written some wonderful articles. One of them she wrote was called Jumping into the Rabbit Hole of Liminality. And she was, that has been published in one of Timothy Carson's books, but I strongly recommend it. But she believes in that. Secondly, I would recommend the songs of Carrie Newcomer. She and Parker Palmer work together, and they have a podcast for about the last 3 or 4 months. They have talked about liminal space and liminal time. And it's wonderful just to hear these two spiritually in tune people talking about these issues. But one of her songs is called Writing a Better Story. And she sings, I'm writing a new ending with a better storyline. Turn the pages and leave the blanks with a plot that's less defined. And though I won't get back a day of stolen time, I could go to bed at night with a better storyline. Leave that what can't be changed in the past. Let the old house burn down and the wind scatter the ash. Forgive myself for all the broken glass, for what I don't know how to say or ask. I'm writing a new story, a new ending with a better storyline. You see how much hope there is in looking back over our lives and saying, well, maybe I got that one wrong. Maybe there are new and deeper meanings in my life than what I thought. And I want to briefly talk about another new book that has just been amazing to me. It's called Life in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age. Here's the book. It's by Bruce Feller. You may have read his earlier book called Walking the Bible, A Journey by Land Through the 5 Books of Moses. Julie and I first heard him speak about his book on Freed Zakaria, his Sunday program. He's the author of 6 bestsellers on the New York Times bestseller list. He grew up in a prominent Jewish community in Savannah, Georgia, 5th generation of that Jewish community. I am personally tied to that community because 2 of the mentors in my legal aid days were H. Saul Clark and Aaron Bushbaum, and they meant a great deal to me in that time, and they were part of that same Jewish community in Savannah. But Bruce, in this book, recounts a time he was living in New York, and a series of crisis moments came in his life. He nearly was bankrupt. He had cancer and went through a very painful recovery. He became a new dad. And his beloved dad, who still lived in Savannah, tried to commit suicide 6 times in a 12-week period. You see, his father had Parkinson's, like his father before him. His father before him had committed suicide in his Parkinson's, and his dad was doing the same old thing. And the family tried everything to help his dad. They tried new therapies, they tried new doctors, they researched new cures, well, new ways to treat it. They got him into counseling. They tried drug therapy. They tried lots of things to help his dad, but nothing worked. Finally, one day, he had a conversation with his dad on the phone, and he asked him a simple little question. He asked him about some things in his childhood, his growing up. He asked him about his favorite toys. He asked him about describing the house where he grew up as a child. He asked him to tell the stories of his being in school and his classmates. This process continued, and he noticed a change in his dad. His dad suddenly began to engage life a bit more. He got interested in his own life story. And he noticed that the suicide watch ended. He never again threatened to commit suicide. And that didn't help the Parkinson's. It continued to worsen. But it made all the difference in the quality of his dad's life in those remaining years. His dad started collecting his own stories. He started exploring his stories, what he liked, the meaning of his life. He collected old photographs and started attaching them to various parts of stories. And when he wasn't able to write anymore, he got somebody to help him write down those stories. His last few years were filled with meaning and purpose. And this made a deep impression on his son, Bruce. Bruce was hooked on the use of personal stories as a means of exploring the meaning in our lives and repairing the damaged places in our lives. And he started something called the Life Story Project. He interviewed hundreds of people around the world, letting them tell their stories, talking about transitions in their life, crisis in their lives, and how they had begun to discover the genuine in themselves after that. It's a wonderful book. He tells story after story of people that found themselves at a bad place, at an impasse. And let me read one or two of those little stories, just little parts of it. He tells the story of a world-class Olympic skater. And he tells that story somewhere in this book. And I've got it marked if I can find it. Sasha Cohen. She had back-to-back disappointments in figure skating at the Winter Olympics, and she was haunted by failure. You see, this world-class skater who had skated around the world and won competitions and done marvelous things, considered herself a failure. She had fallen at the Olympics and her score went down. She would fall from time to time, and she kept asking herself the question, why wasn't I good enough? Why was I such a failure? She finally began to examine herself and ask that question in new ways. And she realized that she wasn't a perfect skater, that she had some physical limits that didn't let her do some of the things that the greatest of all skaters could do. But she realized that her career had been a wonderful one, that she had to overcome obstacles that other people never even thought about, that she had to overcome shortcomings that other people didn't have to go through. And she began to suddenly tell her story in a new way. not as a story of grace and not as a story of failure, but as a story of grace. Not as one of disappointment, but one of achievement, of being the best she could be and glorifying in that. Or another story about a man who was injured in an accident. He was a climber of mountains, a free climber, and he fell and became at age 20 a paraplegic. He thought his life was over, but he began to find new meaning in his life as a Paralympic participant. And he decided one day that he wanted to climb Kilimanjaro. Now, here's a person who had no use of his legs, so he had to use just his arms getting up that 19,500-foot mountain. He pedaled a four-wheel mountain bicycle just using his arms. And Jerry and I have climbed Kilimanjaro, and I had trouble getting it up it with two legs and two arms. And here he is going up that 19,000 feet just on a four-wheel mountain bicycle, just using his arms. He trained and he trained, and he got to within a couple of hundred feet of the top. And it suddenly became too difficult. He was worn out. He was crushed. He couldn't go a foot further. It was really tough there toward the top of the mountain. It gets very steep. The boulders get bigger and bigger, and it gets to be a very difficult climb from the place where the volcano is still active to the very top. And he ran out of gas. He couldn't go another step. He was totally exhausted. So the people that were with him picked up his mountain bicycle, picked him up, and carried him to the top of the mountain. Now, for months after that, he viewed that as a failure. He didn't make it to the top. He had failed. He needed help, and he wanted to do it by himself. And he was a total failure, he felt like, and was very depressed about it. Finally, someone helped him retell that story. And it changed from a story about how he did everything himself to a story about the fact that he was now in the fabric of a team, a community of people that helped each other along the way. And suddenly his story of climbing Kilimanjaro became a story of and I could go on and on about these stories that Bruce tells in his book, but it's a glorious story. It's a glorious book that invites us to look at our stories, to look at the new meanings that we might find, the new ways that we might look at our deep values, our deep meanings in new ways. It's a book that I would strongly recommend. One other person I would recommend is a person called Jane Thibault. She is a Roman Catholic, discovered in her life Thomas Merton. She has taught aging spirituality all of her life. And her bottom line message is this: when you get to the older years of your life, she said, the big challenge is to find meaning and purpose in your life. And ultimately that means spending a part of every day getting closer to God, growing in our relationship to God and to others. I have a lot more to say about this. If you want to hear more about it, you're going to have to visit Peachtree Road and hear that extended conversation on liminality there. But I want to close, and I know we don't have time for questions, so you'll have to email me your questions and we can talk on the phone. But I want to end up with two things. I want to end up a prayer that Walter Brueggemann uses in his book, and I'm going to use it as a meditation that you might want to listen to, and then I want to end with a prayer by Thomas Merton. It goes back to Psalm 77, and this is what Brueggemann writes. Creator God, you have entrusted us with knowledge of good and evil. You have permitted us knowledge of the world in which we live, and the knowledge has yielded immense gains for us, gains of control, of productivity, of explanation, of connections, of causes and effects. Only rarely, like now, do we collide with your hiddenness that summons us, surprises us, embarrasses us. We peek into your awesome hidden presence. We find our certitudes quite disrupted. Thus we pause at the edge of your holiness, finding that your unfathomable presence is an odd mix of mercy and judgment, of generosity and accountability, of forgiveness and starchy realism. We dwell at the edge of your mystery for an instant. Then we return to our proper work of knowledge and research and explanation and management. But for that instant, we are changed, sobered, summoned, emancipated, filled with wonder before your holiness. For it is that holiness that outflanks us and for which we give thanks. And if ever there was a prayer of liminality, it is a prayer written by Thomas Merton. There's a long backstory to this poem that you'll have to hear from me at another time, another place. But it's a prayer that I want us to bow our heads, and I want to leave us with the words of Thomas Merton in a time of liminality. My dear Lord, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me clearly. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself, and the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire in all that I'm doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right path, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bless all of you.